There is a line near the opening of Deuteronomy that can stay with a person for years. It is 11 days' journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Sinai to Kadesh Barnea. Deuteronomy 1:2. 11 days. That is the stated distance. Yet the people standing east of the Jordan hear those words after an entire generation has been buried in the wilderness. The question is not hard to state, it is hard to answer. How does an 11-day route become 40 years? The usual answer is disobedience, and that answer is true. But it is not the whole truth. The deeper issue is that Israel leaves Egypt in body before it leaves Egypt in memory, instinct, fear, and desire. Exodus 12 tells us they walk out under the pressure of judgment and deliverance. Exodus 14 shows the sea opening and the army behind them collapsing into the waters. That is freedom in one sense. It is sudden, it is dramatic, it is visible, but the habits formed under power do not fall off as quickly as shackles do. That difference matters. A person can be released and still think like a captive. A community can be rescued and still long for the predictability of bondage. The biblical text is unusually honest about this. It does not romanticize the generation that came out of Egypt. It preserves their fear, their complaints, their reversals, and their exhausted distrust. It lets us hear them speak. Often that is where the wound opens. The wilderness, in Hebrew midbar, is not only empty sand. The word can refer to uncultivated pasture land, a place beyond settled control, a region where ordinary supports are thin and where a people can no longer hide behind the structures that once carried them. In Egypt, there had been food systems, labor systems, masters, quotas, punishments, habits, familiar humiliations. In the wilderness, much of that disappears. The people are no longer being driven by Pharaoh, but they are also no longer buffered by the routines that made life legible, even when life was cruel. Freedom can feel like exposure before it feels like joy. So the desert becomes more than a route. It becomes a mirror. Israel is brought into a place where there is no empire to blame for every response, no market to stabilize the day, no river like the Nile to anchor the imagination of abundance. What remains is the difficult question of whether this people can live before the God who brought them out. Can they trust a presence they cannot manage? Can they receive a future they have not built? Can they become something other than an escaped labor force? This is why the story moves far beyond movement on a map. Sinai is not a scenic interruption. The tabernacle is not an ornamental detail. The census lists, camp arrangements, purity laws, food provision, disputes over leadership, and long stretches of frustration all belong to the same work. A people is being made, not merely transported. That takes longer. Some readers treat the 40 years as if they were only a penalty inserted after the failure of the spies in Numbers 13 and 14. The text certainly says, judgment falls there, and the sentence is severe. Yet Deuteronomy 8:2-3 frames the wilderness more broadly. A place of humbling, testing, feeding, and teaching, so that Israel might learn that life does not rest on bread alone, but on every word that comes from God. And the years carry judgment. They also carry formation. Both are true. That is part of the discomfort of the story. God is not only punishing rebellion, He is also undoing Egypt within them, and that work is slow. The first generation does not fail because they lacked information. They saw plagues. They saw the sea split. They saw water come from rock. They saw bread appear with the morning dew. The problem is stranger than ignorance. They keep reinterpreting rescue through the logic of slavery. Every pressure sends them mentally backward. Every lack raises the question of whether bondage with food was better than freedom with uncertainty. They are not merely traveling through the desert. They are being confronted by themselves. That is why Deuteronomy's 11-day line lands with such force. It is not a note for tourists. It is a wound in the text. The land was near, readiness was not. And that difference still reaches beyond ancient Israel, because the distance between deliverance and maturity is rarely measured in miles. Chapter 2. Egypt after Egypt. The Bible does not say that Egypt was left behind cleanly. It says almost the opposite. Again and again, once hardship returns, the people begin to speak as though their past has improved in memory. They remember bread, fish, cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. They do not speak first about the whips. They do not begin with dead infants or forced labor. That selectiveness is important. Bondage often survives in memory by editing itself. Exodus 16 gives one of the earliest examples. Hunger rises. The people accuse Moses and Aaron of bringing them into the wilderness to kill the assembly with hunger. The accusation is brutal because it recasts deliverance as a kind of execution. God answers with manna, yet the provision is not simply about calories. It is structured. Gather enough for the day. Do not hoard. Gather double before Sabbath. Rest on the seventh day. In other words, bread becomes instruction. Dependence is being retrained in public. That sounds gentle when read quickly. It was not gentle to live. Daily provision means daily uncertainty unless trust has taken root. Some of the people try to store more than they were told and find it spoiled by morning. Others go out to gather on the Sabbath and find nothing. The issue is not agricultural efficiency. The issue is whether Israel can live without the anxious reflex that says survival belongs only to those who seize control. The longing for Egypt keeps returning because Egypt represented more than geography. It represented a total system. There was pain there, but there was also predictability. Slavery is a terrible shelter, but it is still a shelter. In the wilderness, God does not replace Pharaoh by becoming a more manageable version of Pharaoh. That is part of Israel's difficulty. The Lord is not another master who can be bribed, localized, or manipulated into stable output. He gives, he commands, he tests, he remains free. Listen to the complaints across Exodus and Numbers, and a pattern appears. At the sea in Exodus 14, the people say it would have been better to serve the Egyptians than die in the wilderness. At Marah, bitter water becomes a crisis. At Rephidim, thirst becomes an accusation. Is the Lord among us or not? Exodus 17:7. In Numbers 11, weariness with manna erupts again. In Numbers 14, after the spies return, they speak of choosing a leader and going back to Egypt. That is not nostalgia alone. It is political imagination collapsing into the only world they know. Some readers call this ingratitude and move on. The text allows that judgment, but it asks for more careful attention too. 4 centuries in Egypt means more than oppression. It means formation inside another civilization's rhythms, symbols, and fears. The people have known Egyptian power for generations. They have seen how empire feeds, organizes, punishes, measures, and secures. They know what domination feels like, but they also know what it means to live under a system that tells them what tomorrow will require. Remove that system, and fear can masquerade as wisdom. That is why the wilderness should not be misread as empty waiting time between the exciting parts. It is the place where Israel's interior life is brought into the open. No empire stands between them and the God who has claimed them. No bureaucracy absorbs responsibility. No one can pretend the real issue is merely logistics. The desert is severe because it strips away illusion. It shows that miracles alone do not make a people faithful. And still, the narrative is not contemptuous toward them. It is sharper than that, and kinder. God feeds them. God guides them by cloud and fire. God hears Moses when he intercedes. Even the complaints are preserved in Scripture rather than erased, which means the text is not constructing a polished national origin story. It is preserving a painful truth about how difficult freedom can be for those trained by fear. This chapter of Israel's life is uncomfortable because it will not let us separate physical rescue from inward change. The Exodus is real. So is the residue of Egypt. The sea has closed behind them, yet Egypt is still speaking in their mouths. Chapter 3. The Mountain and the Making of a People. If the Exodus breaks a chain, Sinai gives shape to a people who no longer belong to Pharaoh. That is why Exodus 19 through 24 stands near the center of the story. The mountain is not simply a dramatic backdrop for divine speech. It is the place where a liberated crowd begins to receive a common life. The scene opens with both nearness and danger. Israel reaches Sinai in the 3rd month after leaving Egypt. The mountain burns with the presence of God. There is thunder, trumpet, smoke, and boundary. The people are told not to rush the holy place. Moses goes up. Moses comes down. Words are spoken that will order everything else. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Exodus 22. The commandments do not begin with abstract rule. They begin with identity and deliverance. Obedience is not being sold as a ladder toward rescue. It is being given to a people who have already been rescued. That order is easy to miss. It matters. Israel is not asked to earn the Exodus. Israel is being taught how the Exodus should now be lived. The 10 Commandments receive the most attention, as they should, yet the larger legal material around them is just as telling. There are laws about servants, violence, restitution, property, festivals, Sabbath, sexual boundaries, judicial integrity, treatment of the vulnerable, and reverence in worship. This is what nationhood looks like in biblical form. Not grand speeches alone, not national myths alone. Concrete social practice. Widows matter, foreigners matter, debt matters, time matters, speech matters, bodies matter, worship matters. A people becomes visible in what it protects, what it forbids, and what it remembers. Some scholars argue that the shape of the Sinai covenant resembles ancient Near Eastern treaty forms, with a great king declaring identity, terms, loyalty, blessing, and consequence. Others think the parallels should not be pressed too neatly. Either way, the point remains that Sinai is not random legislation dropped into the desert. It is covenant order. Israel is being addressed not as a loose escapee population, but as a people bound to the God who brought them out. Then comes the tabernacle. Modern readers often lose patience there. Measurements blur together. Fabrics, rings, sockets, lampstands, altars, priestly garments, incense, and sacrificial regulations can feel remote. Yet in narrative terms, this material is astonishing. The God who shook the mountain will dwell in the midst of the camp, not in a palace city, not behind Nile monuments, in a movable sanctuary carried through the desert. The architecture says something radical. Divine holiness will travel with this people, and therefore this people cannot treat ordinary life as spiritually neutral. The camp itself is arranged around that center. Israel is not formed around a king's throne or military command. It is formed around presence. That does not remove politics, conflict, or hierarchy, but it does relocate the heart of the nation. In Egypt, power radiated from Pharaoh. In Israel's calling, life is meant to radiate outward from the place where God meets the people by covenant and atonement. This is why the wilderness is nation-making ground. Law is not an interruption to freedom. Properly understood, it is what keeps freedom from dissolving into appetite, panic, and imitation of the empires left behind. A people without shape can only drift toward the nearest strong hand. Sinai refuses that drift. There is another detail worth holding here. When the people hear the thunder and see the smoking mountain, and they recoil and ask Moses to mediate, lest they die, Exodus 20:18-21. That fear is not wholly wrong. The holiness of God is not manageable. Yet it also creates a tension that will persist. Israel wants God near enough to bless, but not so near as to unsettle. The covenant offers intimacy with the living God, and that intimacy is glorious. It is also demanding. It exposes lies, limits desire, and forbids the little substitutions by which human communities usually keep themselves comfortable. So Sinai does not merely hand Israel a religion. It gives Israel a moral world, a social grammar, a pattern of time, a center of worship, a way of naming justice, and a deep reminder that being chosen is not the same thing as being indulged. At the mountain, a people is being assembled from the inside out. Chapter 4. The calf beneath the thunder. Then, almost immediately, fracture. Exodus 32 is painful partly because of its timing. Moses is on the mountain. The covenant has been spoken. The people have heard the words. Instructions for holy presence are being given. And below that mountain, where fire still marks the divine nearness, the people ask Aaron to make gods who will go before them, because, as they say, they do not know what has become of Moses. That line exposes more than impatience. It reveals how quickly visible absence becomes theological crisis. Moses has delayed. Therefore, certainty feels gone. Therefore, something solid, shaped, and local must be produced. Gold is gathered. A calf is fashioned. An altar is built. A feast follows. The scene is both religious and political, because worship always arranges communal loyalty. What exactly the calf meant is disputed. Some historians think the image carries echoes of Egyptian bull symbolism, perhaps connected in memory with Apis or related forms of strength, fertility, and sacred power. Others caution that the story should not be reduced to direct borrowing, because calf and bull imagery was widespread across the ancient Near East. Either way, the point is not that Israel suddenly forgets the Lord's name. The point is that the people reach for a form of worship they can see, celebrate, and carry without trembling before the freedom of the God who speaks from fire. Aaron's role makes the moment sadder. He is not introduced as a rival to Moses. He is introduced as his brother, his partner, one entrusted with leadership under pressure. Yet pressure exposes him. He accommodates the crowd. Later, he explains himself weakly, as though the calf somehow emerged on its own. Leadership fails here not only through rebellion, but through soft surrender. A people in fear often tests whether its leaders will absorb anxiety, or echo it. Aaron echoes it. The text is severe. Moses descends. The tablets are broken. The calf is ground down. Judgment falls. Yet there is also intercession. Moses stands between the people and destruction, pleading on the basis of God's own name, promise, and reputation among the nations. This is one of the places where Moses appears not merely as administrator, but as mediator, carrying both indignation and love. He sees the sin clearly. He does not stop belonging to the people who committed it. What makes the golden calf episode so enduring is that it is not only about idols made of metal. It is about what communities do when patience breaks and transcendence becomes intolerable. A God who cannot be handled feels dangerous. An image can be placed where one wants it, adorned when one wishes, and celebrated on schedule. That desire runs deep. It is older than Israel and not limited to the ancient world. There is also a bitter irony in the chapter. While God is giving instructions for the tabernacle, a place ordered by holy presence, the people construct an alternative center below. One sanctuary would teach reverence, confession, mediation, and obedience. The other offers immediacy and control. One is received, the other is manufactured. One forms a covenant people. The other gives a frightened crowd the illusion that divine power can be stabilized by human hands. Still, the story does not end in erasure. Covenant is wounded, but not abandoned. Moses returns to the mountain. New tablets are given. The breach is real, and so is mercy. That combination matters. The Bible does not protect God's holiness by minimizing sin, nor does it protect moral seriousness by denying the possibility of restoration. Israel survives the mountain because judgment and intercession meet there. The calf episode also clarifies something about Egypt's lingering power. The people did not leave behind only chains. They left behind habits of worship shaped by visibility, repetition, and control. The desert exposed that residue. So did delay. So did fear. Beneath the thunder of Sinai, Israel reached back toward a God small enough to fit its anxiety. The wound would not heal quickly. Chapter 5. Bread, thirst, and the daily test. Public disasters are easy to notice. Daily tests are harder. Yet much of the wilderness story turns not on spectacular rebellion, but on repeated encounters with lack, time, hunger, thirst, and exhaustion. This is where Israel is slowly measured. It is also where Israel is slowly taught. Manna is the clearest example. It appears with the morning, fragile and sufficient, impossible to stockpile beyond its appointed time. Deuteronomy 8 looks back on this and gives the interpretation. God humbled Israel, let them hunger, and fed them with manna, so that they might learn that human life is upheld by more than bread alone. That line is often quoted in later scripture, but in its original setting, it belongs to an education in dependence. Israel is being trained to receive life as gift without turning gift into possession. This is not romantic spirituality. Hunger is real. Fatigue is real. Numbers 11 shows how quickly dissatisfaction returns. The people grow tired of manna and remember Egypt's foods with selective tenderness. Their desire becomes accusation. Moses himself buckles under the weight of the people's demands and tells the Lord that the burden is too heavy for him. That honesty matters. The wilderness does not test only the crowd, it tests the leader. Leadership strain keeps surfacing. Jethro's earlier counsel in Exodus 18 had already shown that Moses could not carry every dispute alone. Later, in Numbers, conflicts multiply: grumbling, jealousy, rebellion, disputes over authority, disputes over provision. The wilderness is not a noble school in a sentimental sense. It is abrasive. It reveals who a people becomes when ordinary comforts are stripped away. Water scenes intensify this further. At Rephidim in Exodus 17 and later at Meribah in Numbers 20, thirst exposes not only the people's distrust, but Moses' own dangerous weariness. The later episode is especially sobering. God tells Moses to speak to the rock. Instead, Moses speaks bitterly to the people and strikes the rock. Water comes, yet Moses and Aaron are told they will not bring the assembly into the promised land because they did not uphold God as holy before the people. The judgment can feel severe. Some interpreters emphasize the disobedient act itself. Others focus on the way Moses' anger distorted his representative role. Either way, the scene makes one truth unavoidable. Proximity to God's work does not place a leader beyond accountability. That keeps the wilderness from becoming a simple story of bad followers and noble guides. Moses is great, but he is not flawless. Aaron is chosen, but he is not steady enough. Miriam is honored, yet even she becomes part of conflict and correction. No human figure in the desert carries the story without fracture. That too is part of Israel's education. If the nation is ever to live in the land faithfully, it cannot rest its future on charisma alone. What then is God doing through these repetitive pressures? Not merely proving that people fail. The pattern is more constructive than that. Time after time, Israel is being moved from reaction toward remembrance. Remember who brought you out. Remember what the Lord did at the sea. Remember the covenant. Remember the command. Remember the day of rest. Remember the judgments that fell. Memory, in Deuteronomy especially, becomes a moral act. Forgetfulness is not passive, it is dangerous. This makes the wilderness story more intimate than many retellings allow. The issue is not simply whether the nation will arrive somewhere. The issue is whether trust can survive ordinary need without collapsing into panic. Bread must be gathered, water must be found, disputes must be settled, marches must continue, graves must be dug, children must be raised, life goes on. And within that repetitive life, a people is either learning fidelity or returning inwardly to slavery. Nothing about this is glamorous. Much of it feels painfully familiar. That may be why the desert sections of Scripture still carry weight. And they know that the deepest tests are often not dramatic temptations, but recurring needs that ask the same question in slightly different forms. Will you trust the God who gave yesterday's bread when today's bread has not yet appeared? Chapter 6. Kadesh, where fear became a decision. The long tension of the wilderness narrows to a crisis at Kadesh Barnea. Numbers 13 and 14 records the moment with terrible clarity. Spies are sent into the land. They return after 40 days, carrying evidence of abundance, including the famous cluster of grapes from the valley of Eshcol. The land is good. On that point, there is agreement. The division comes over what that goodness demands. 10 of the spies look at fortified cities, strong inhabitants, and the descendants of Anak, and they conclude that the promise is overwhelmed by circumstance. Caleb speaks first against the tide, urging the people to go up at once. Later, Joshua joins him explicitly. Their confidence is not based on military naivete. It is based on the conviction that the Lord who promised the land is not defeated by the size of the obstacle. The others are not lying about danger. They are interpreting danger as final. That distinction is everything. Fear, in the biblical account, is rarely just an emotion. It becomes a lens. Once fear takes control, abundance itself becomes threatening, and memory becomes corrupted again. The people weep. They murmur against Moses and Aaron. They speak of appointing a leader and returning to Egypt. The language is stunning because it shows that a nation can stand at the threshold of promise and still prefer familiar servitude to risky obedience. Here, the 11-day wound of Deuteronomy finds its explanation. The route was short. The people were divided within themselves. What held them back was not terrain alone, but trust. Some scholars read the spies episode primarily as a failure of military courage. Others stress that the deeper sin is contempt for God's faithfulness after repeated acts of deliverance. The text itself seems to support the second emphasis. God's words in Numbers 14 ask how long the people will despise him and refuse belief despite the signs done among them. What is judged is not caution, but covenantal unbelief. The sentence follows with austere symmetry. The 40 days of scouting become 40 years in the wilderness, 1 year for each day. The generation counted for war will fall in the desert. Their children, whom the parents feared would become prey, each will inherit the land instead. There is pathos in that reversal. The adults cast themselves as protectors through refusal. Their refusal becomes the very thing that delays their children's inheritance. Even then, the people misread the moment. Once judgment is announced, some attempt to go up into the hill country against command. They had refused when obedience required courage. Now they advance when repentance requires submission. Presumption replaces trust as quickly as fear had replaced it before. They are defeated. That sequence matters because it shows that religious energy is not the same thing as faithful timing. Zeal itself can become another form of self-will. Kadesh is one of the bleakest places in the Pentateuch because the national future does not collapse all at once. It is deferred. The people keep moving, but the generation under sentence now walks inside an ending it has chosen. Funerals accumulate, time lengthens. The desert becomes not only school, but cemetery. And yet this is not merely a story of waste. Children are growing up while the old generation falls. Memory is shifting. Those who cross the sea as dependents of Egyptian supply are not the same as those raised under manna, cloud, camp order, and wilderness law. The children know hardship, but they do not know Egypt as home. They know Moses' voice, not Pharaoh's. They know the tabernacle in the center of camp. They know that unbelief has consequences because they are living inside those consequences. If this telling of the wilderness matters to you, stay with the channel. There is more room in these biblical stories than quick summaries usually allow. Kadesh, then, and is not just the place where fear speaks loudly. It is the place where fear becomes policy, where policy becomes judgment, and where judgment begins to make way for another generation. The land did not move farther away. Israel did. Chapter 7. The Children of the Wilderness. By the time Deuteronomy opens, the voice we hear is no longer that of a people fresh from Egypt. A generation has passed. Moses speaks on the plains of Moab to those who have lived their whole conscious lives under the conditions of the wilderness. They know the stories of the sea and the mountain, but many of them know those events as inherited memory rather than direct sight. That changes the emotional texture of the nation. Moses spends much of Deuteronomy doing what aging leaders do when they know they are near the end and still care deeply about what will remain after them. He repeats, he warns, he interprets the past, he presses memory into the future. The speeches are not filler before Joshua. They are the final attempt to hand Israel not only commands but understanding. Do not say in your heart that you gained this land by your own righteousness. Do not forget the Lord in abundance. Do not become swollen with possession and lose the memory of dependence learned in the desert. The wilderness, for Moses, is not a regrettable delay to be forgotten once the land is reached. It is the hard education without which the land itself will become spiritually dangerous. There is sorrow here too. Moses will see the land from a distance, but will not enter it. Deuteronomy 34 places him on Nebo, looking across the territory promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The scene is quiet and devastating. The leader who faced Pharaoh stretched out his hand over the sea, ascended Sinai, shattered the first tablets, interceded after the calf, judged disputes, endured complaints, and carried this people for decades, does not cross over. Greatness does not erase consequence. That final boundary keeps Moses human in the strongest possible way. Joshua stands beside that boundary as the man who will continue the work. He is not Moses, and the text does not pretend otherwise. But he is not required to be Moses. He is charged to be strong and courageous, to attend to the law, and to lead a people who have already watched what happens when courage drains away at the edge of promise. Joshua carries memory forward, but he also represents change. The nation must move from wandering to possession, from tutoring to responsibility. What kind of people are these children of the wilderness? They are not innocent in some idealized sense. The biblical story never speaks that way, yet they are differently formed. Egypt is not the controlling image in their imagination. The desert is. They have learned mobility, dependence, burial, discipline, and delay. They have watched a whole generation disappear under judgment. They have heard blessing and curse set side by side. They know that covenant is not sentimental language. It is life and death. This is what makes the end of the 40 years more than a geographical milestone. Israel is finally near the land as a people who can at least hear what the first generation would not hear steadily. Not perfectly, not permanently. The later books of the Bible will make that painfully clear. But there is a real transition here. The nation that began as a mass of released laborers now stands with law, worship, leadership succession, memory, and a sharpened sense of what unbelief costs. That may be the most searching truth in this whole journey. God's promise was never fragile. Israel's readiness was. The years in the wilderness did not expose weakness in the promise, but weakness in the people who were meant to receive it. At the same time, those same years became the means by which another people, descended from the first and chastened by its failure, was prepared to go forward. So the 40 years should not be told only as a cautionary tale about rebellion, though they are certainly that. They should also be told as a long work of remaking. Egypt was left in a night. Egypt left Israel much more slowly. The desert was where that struggle surfaced, where covenant replaced mere escape, where leadership was tested, where false worship was uncovered, where fear delayed inheritance, and where children learned a different grammar of life under God. If careful biblical storytelling helps you hear these passages with fresher attention, you can stay with the channel. There is more to explore. And perhaps that is where the story finally reaches us. Not in the question of how many campsites they crossed or how harsh the sun was, though those details matter, but in the deeper question Deuteronomy leaves ringing behind its opening wound. What turns an 11-day journey into 40 years? Sometimes the answer is not distance. Sometimes it is the long, painful work of becoming the kind of people who can live faithfully inside a gift once it arrives.